Hey, it's Dan Graetz. My friends call me Graetzy. And if you're wondering where the undercurrent's coming from today, well, my non-undercurrent work has brought me to the beautiful city of Adelaide and this nondescript hotel room where I'd still like to bring you my three things this week, but cheat a little bit and instead talk about three people. If you tuned into last week's episode or saw some of my TikToks or Instagram lives, you would have known I was in Launceston, where just some of the independent candidates and community groups got together to talk about strategy for this upcoming election. They chose a brewery as the location for the meeting, so that's like 15 XP they get awarded right there. And it was a really interesting thing to check out because the dynamic wasn't of a professional political party. There were no talking points, there were no party platforms. They just got in a room and hashed it out.
We just need some really mature people in that place collaborating, cooperating and making a difference.
And they definitely didn't all agree the whole time, but they all seem to agree that the status quo as it currently stands simply doesn't work. The major parties have completely failed to represent their communities, to stick to the things that they've even promised. And so ordinary people are putting their hands up and saying, okay, I'm going to run. I don't particularly want to, but I feel like I have to. And I really want you to meet them right now. We're going to start with Craig Garland, who's a local fisherman who's running in the seat of Braddon. If you're a political tragic like me and you watched the last Tasmanian state election coverage, you would have seen him make an interesting cameo and even cause the unflappable Anthony Green to have a little bit of a moment.
While the election was being telecast, all the votes come in from King Island and my area first. So Anthony Green, the election analyst, was going along. He's going Labor 10%, Liberal 12%, and then Craig Garland 23%. And he went, Craig Garland, 23%. It was like I sort of came from nowhere. Through one thing and another, sort of thrown at us by the government, I decided to get political, and it was the only avenue I had to express my discontent about what was happening and trying to get something constructive done. Labor, Liberal, Labor, Liberal, Labor, Liberal. You know, they get sick of one, they throw the other in. It was compared to an abusive relationship just recently, because in my time, what they've done to this state, whether you're talking our fisheries, our forestry, our farming, our youth, the health system, you know, the lack of tax reform when big companies are getting away with blue murder, like the salmon industry, turn over $3 or $4 billion and pay a pittance in the lease arrangements, whether you're talking the Farrell family that take all that revenue from the gambling industry, which is taking money away from our communities. And the first step is acknowledging the problem, which I think most people have now, and the second step is actually doing something about it. And that's why independence is so crucial in this point in time, because we have to display to those major parties that it's no longer good enough. Hopefully enough major party voters will throw that vote behind the independent to get that diversity and accountability in the political system.
Next up, you're going to hear from Andrea Courtney, who's also running in the seat of Braddon. Andrea is a community and welfare advocate, she's a union delegate, and she's a single mum.
I'm running because I think that a lot of the people that have been disenfranchised and not represented are getting angry with politics. The most important thing to me is whistleblowers. If you keep your whistleblowers protected and there's problems in health, they will come out, they will be held accountable by the public. If there is problems in the way that environmental approvals are done, if you protect your whistleblowers, it will come out to the public and they will be held accountable. I think that in education, we need to teach kids how important it is to understand policies. We need to get politics into schools so they understand what governance is. They understand that these are the policies that decide what their pays are, what their rents are, what their rights are. Liberal and Labor don't look much different to each other. So I think you've got Labor being considered liberal light, and Liberals are now moving further backwards towards conservative religious doctrination of our policies. So I think this is the best time ever for independents to be able to say, well, yeah, they do look a lot alike and neither of them are fixing the problems. One will blame the other and then next term it'll go backwards, but neither of them are actually offering alternatives that fix the systemic problems that we have. So it's not so much about me, it's more about the fact that, kind of like a union, the more of us that stick together and we all lift each other up, then all boats rise. That's the way I'm looking at it.
A third candidate is Jack Davenport, who's running in the seat of Bass. Now, in a previous episode, you might have heard me reference the child sex abuse scandals that have rocked the Tasmanian government and have been covered up for 20 years, and there are still efforts to continue covering them up. Well, Jack is a social worker who specialises in child protection, and he even gave evidence at the Commission of Inquiry into the Tasmanian government's responses to child sexual abuses in institutional settings.
We need a voice that reaches out to community. Political parties, you can tell, are constrained by a parliamentary pathway, and you could do some good, but without a community pathway, there's going to never be meaningful reform. There's going to be nothing that meets the interests and needs of the people of Tasmania, and that's what is important to me. One day I started to hear about issues around Ashley and about whistleblowers and something to do with a nurse at a hospital, and more and more things came to my attention about what was actually going on. When we talk about the child abuse that has occurred in these institutions, you look at the perpetrators of that abuse, and then you step back and you realize the people that had oversight and responsibility have actually almost in many cases actively enabled that abuse to occur because they wanted to protect the interests of the agency over the interests of children. And that stems from ultimately a corruption at the heart of Tasmanian politics.
Like I said, these are real people. There's no flash, there's no talking points. They just want to make things better for their community. And if you notice that the sausage to flange ratio was a little out of whack, I've actually got a fourth person to balance that out. The meeting in Launceston actually had a special guest drop in, currently sitting Upper House State member Meg Webb, who's not associated with the Voices of Tasmania, but dropped in to give them some advice from her experience sitting in Parliament as an independent. And I'm interested to see what you think of this one, because Meg kind of rocked my world.
It's a real challenge to be elected as an independent to a parliament anywhere, a state level or a federal level. It takes a hell of a lot of work and a hell of a lot of support from your community to get there. What I think we need to be really focused on is making sure that we think of the move towards independence in our systems of governance as a long-term project. We build capacity, we find great people to run, we support them, and then we support them again if they're not successful the first time.
What do you see in the future for independence, not just holding the balance of power, but maybe actually driving government on a larger scale?
It's an interesting hypothetical, isn't it? A parliament in which there are enough independents theoretically to form a government. If and when we got to that hypothetical point of a parliament where there was enough independence to form government, we would have developed ways of working in that parliament over time as the number of independents were slowly growing. If we've had to build our way towards it and the community have rewarded that because of its effectiveness by voting even more independents in such that there were enough to form government, I reckon it'll be working pretty well. What immediately comes to my mind as a benefit of that is that it'd be really hard for vested interests to influence outcomes, because there's a lot of independent thinking there that is representing the community, and that's a really difficult space for vested interests to try and take control of, the way that they so readily can take control of what we currently have with two major parties, a duopoly. I have no interest in towing a party line. I've never been involved in party politics, and the sort of difference I want to make is for my community. And so anything that would put other interests, party interests, ahead of community interests would be anathema to me. I'm just not interested in it. What you tend to find is parties think short term, they think in electoral cycles, they make decisions based on winning power instead of a long-term strategic view for their community. I absolutely love my job as an independent representative in the Tasmanian Upper House. It's meaningful every day when I go to work, and that is basically when I open my eyes in the morning. I know exactly why I'm there. I know that I want to be making a difference and that I'll have opportunities every day to make a difference. It is a job that's never done, so it's a really consuming, really overwhelming job. It's one that is the hardest work I've ever done and the most rewarding work I've ever done. I absolutely recommend it to people who do genuinely want to make a difference and represent their community, and never underestimate that it's going to be hard to get the job, and it's going to be really hard to do the work you need to do when you get there, and you'll love every second.
So, in a couple of weeks' time, when Anthony Green announces the winners in the Tasmanian state election, I know I'll be rocking backwards and forwards in the fetal position, sucking my thumb, hoping for the best for these amazing independent candidates who stood up and said, you know what, we've had decades of failure by the two major parties, let's take matters into our own hands. And if you've got a story you think needs telling, hit us up at theundercurrent.com.